thank you all for turning out on this incredibly hot evening. I'm so impressed that Judith had the extra chairs and so forth on the meeting late meeting. Right, we better get going because we've got rather a lot of pictures for you. The way it's going to work is I'm going to talk first, and then Rebecca is going to follow. So you're going to talk about all the misery, and then you get back, you get me back in the second half. And if we overrun, then we'll cut a little bit of my second shot, if that's all right with you. Right, let's go on to the first. This is just, you'll see this picture again, the poor lawn lady sitting in the cellar late when Rebecca is talking. Yes, this is a bit of a PR slide to say this is the book which it rather seems a shame that Malcolm wasted his Northumbrian evenings reading, but I'm glad he enjoyed it. Here is the PR. The publisher is Brand Dog Books. That's what you'll pay for it. It's £7.50. And if any of you should be kind enough to want to buy copies, they are indeed here. And there's a full panoply of St Giles staff at the back. Philip and Claire to help with the sales of it. And so please do buy it because and what's the print? I don't know, 300. So it's not that big. So yeah, it's still very precious at common commodity, books and so forth. So it may seem expensive to you. This would be more expensive when you get some books. That's what I have to say.
Autograph them.
Beg your pardon?
Autograph them.
Not many, one or two. Yeah, we might if you would really press us. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and just something about the cover. I will also say this cover comes from a rather tatty but very large blown-up photograph which we found in one of the galleries, the rather underused galleries of the parish church, and we loved it from the beginning. And I think you will agree it's a very arresting image, and it really is a very indicative sign of the kind of history of the parish from at least 1730s when that church was built, the present church was built, down to the building centre point in 1960. It's so arresting and so impressive. I think everybody said it's a very good cover, so we're very pleased with it. Even if it's black and white, not multicoloured, you get the lady who's just sort of the back on the back. So let me say a little bit before we get into it about the history of the project. What Malcolm said about exploring the area and wondering about the back streets and alleys and so forth is exactly how it began. It began to a large degree with the rector Alan Carr up there, top right, as was at the time, who felt when he came to be the rector that he didn't know enough. People kept saying things to him about the parish, and he couldn't puzzle by about the rookery and this, that, and the other. And he felt the need to know very much more about it and couldn't find what he wanted to know. And so the parish very generously scraped together the money to employ Rebecca and myself to write this book, which I think we very much enjoyed doing. You will say that now it's finished, of course. They gave us complete carte blanche about it, except to say this is not a religious book. It's not about the history of the church mainly, although that comes into it, and I will talk a bit about that. It's about the history of the parish, social history, if you like, use a kind of more cliche, and about everything that happened to it. It is an incredibly interesting and rich parish, as I'm sure you know. And the other thing I should say also, which I think was on the slide just before that, is that remarkably, it's just about the only modern history of a London parish. There was a pretty good, very good history of St Andrew Saint by Caroline Barron back in the 70s, but that was not as generous in scale as ours is, and it's remarkable how little else there is. The survey of London plugs on, and Rebecca works for it. I used to work for it. They're doing bits of London, very, very important and impressive work it is. But that's more architectural, it is more broad. And although we both have talked about architecture, we also were very well aware that architecture was not what was primarily wanted. So it tries to be even and to cover everything. Of course, we can't possibly cover everything. And we had all sorts of struggles about how to resolve chronology and topography. But you don't want to hear about the structure, you want to hear what's in the book. So we'll just do that. Before I I go on to the next one, I should just point out to you that there's a gentleman, I hear it, he's at the back now, Will James. We owe an enormous amount to Will because he managed the project very patiently and expertly from beginning to end. And without him, it wouldn't have happened. We would have felt very lonely. And so thank you, Will, very much for all you did. You've been a great manager and patient with us, and your project had to prod us a little bit, I think. So, what is St Giles? Well, that's a good question in a way, because it's often now associated just with the area around the parish church, which is tucked in there behind St Point. You just see it very much overshadowed now by that big colourful monster called Central St Giles, even more recently than Centre Point. But it is a very, very ancient a parish, and even before that it was the leper hospital, which Rebecca is going to explain and talk to you about. I'm not going to do that stuff. These are just two maps that show the parish as was. It's been altered in the 1970s and 80s to a different shape, but this is the historic parish. I don't know how well you can see it in the back, as it was in about 1800, as it was in about 1950. I think you could see it well enough to know that it extends way up from above the line of New Oxford Street, right up to Tavistock Place, actually, as originally was, in a kind of funny way. And it's divided in an odd way because this blue line, which you may not be able to see very well, it's on both of the maps, shows on an order plot where St George's Bloomsbury, which is just a new kid on the block, invented by Hawksmoor and all those people after the 1730s, and hogging all the bits of Bloomsbury, which were developed thereafter. That was taken out of St Giles. St Giles was a much bigger parish than it now is. The southern boundary is very difficult to explain or describe. It included in the parish Lincoln's Inn Fields originally, and the boundary is a kind of funny thing through Long Acre and comes out round about the middle of St Giles and so forth. And Charing Cross Road is more or less the western boundary. So it's complicated, but it was big, big, big. One of the most important extra in the West End parishes, really, but never thought of by most people as part of central London. I think partly because it's not in Westminster, in the bigger entity of Westminster. It's always been outside Westminster, or originally independently, now of course part of Camden, the Camden-Westminster boundary, in the kind of what people call the Covent Garden area. We'll talk about that in a bit. More or less, it's the same as the old St Giles boundary on the south side, and it's not a rational boundary anyway. So there we are. But I think you also see from these two maps, which are especially drawn by the rather wonderful David Weston artist, who does rather beautiful maps, how between about 1800, when that one is, and this one, you may not see so well from far off, most of the area north of Great Russell Street was simply not developed at all. That comes after 1800, more or less, with very few exceptions. So it's a parish whose density was all around the church up till about 1800. Great Russell Street and that southern part of Bloomsbury is 18th century, but most of it's later. Okay, here you perhaps get a rather better sense of how it was until Bloomsbury started to develop. This is a map about 1720, which actually does show St George's Bloomsbury there, although paradoxically, that map is supposed to be 1720, but the map is yet shown 1730. So it's a bit complicated, but nevertheless, it does give a sense of how the parish was just at the point where St George's Bloomsbury was taken out of it. So we've had the task of dealing with things like Bloomsbury Square, here, Southampton Square still, for the early history of it, but not for the later history. So I hope that's not too inconvenient for those who want it. And there you see very clear, that's more clearly the southern boundary, where Lincoln's Inn Fields is in. This is always St Martin's, actually. St Martin's Inn Fields comes between St Giles and Covent Garden, although the name Covent Garden has become generically used for so much of this area now, as you will know. So a bit more now. First, a little bit about the church. I said when we deal with the church. First, there have been 3 churches, as far as we're aware, on the current site of the 18th century church. This is number 2. Rebecca will talk a little bit more about number 1, but which we don't know very much about its physical look. And this probably, in some respects, was a bit like a kind of updated 17th century copy of the medieval parish church. You can see it's in the Gothic style, although it was built in the 1620s. And it had a very interesting moment because the rector of that time was a very energetic high church rector, very big supporter of the king, and got into trouble, of course, when things began to go wrong. The parliamentarians came to the top in the 1630s. He was out by then. He became the Dean of St David's, the rector of that time. He did rebuild the church, and what's more, he recorded it all in a very, very remarkable book, the likes of which I don't think anybody has for any other London parish, or at least not one in the city, which you're just seeing some small pictures of there. It's called St Giles's Doomsday, Liber Domus Dei Anglicae Doomsday book. You can just about read, so you can go through the script. And what that gives a list of everybody who subscribe to it. It doesn't give a list of the craftsmen. It tells you what they paid, and there's some remarkable entries. For instance, here it says, I don't know if it says, the players of the Cockpit Playhouse, £20. So while the playhouse was down Drury Lane, just in the parish, paid some money towards the church. And this one, which you won't be able to read, particularly records the great donor who paid for a lot of it, who was Lady Alice Dudley, who was still Duchess Dudley, she was a great hero of St Giles, still is the name attached to charity. Here is not Duchess Dudley, but her daughter, and this is one of the almost the only remnant inside the church which records the kind of pre-Slipcock 18th century church. It is beautiful shroud monument, as it's called in the history of sculpture world, in the North Isle, showing Lady Frances Knighton. I won't give you Lady Dudley's full history, but it's a pretty dramatic one. She was married to a cad who was called John Dudley, who ran off to Italy with a lady waiting at a court and left her with lots of daughters that she behaved in an immensely dignified way. She came from a pretty rich family herself, which helped, of course, and lived in a house in Warwickshire, Stoneleigh, and also a big house next to the church. She was a big supporter of king and church, and this probably is something like what her monument would have looked like without the one. This actually is a picture of Lady Dudley's own monument, which is not in St Giles, it's in Stoneleigh in Warwickshire. But we know from descriptions that this was part of a much bigger composition, which was probably taken down when the Flitcroft Church was built, and it shows one of her daughters. But when you read the inscription, which I'm not asking you to do now, you will find a lot of text about mother, not the lady who's shown in the shrine. So rather complicated, but rather moving and impressive story, Lady Dudley and her daughter. Then we come to the last church, the one that's still with us today, and you see immediately, just from the two pictures, how little has changed. It's incredible when you think everything that's happened around it, that church is more or less exactly as it was. It's some fiddling changes, but it really is essentially an 18th century church. That's a famous perspective of 1753, I think, and on the right, a picture taken from a very similar angle, especially for the book by Chris Redgrave. A very difficult picture to take, high up from one of the houses in Denmark Street, showing how little things have changed at all. So, I mean, and even this I suppose is the best you've had. It's not very clever, it's not very efficient. It's more or less still there. So remarkable and surprising continuity. The Victorians, for instance, didn't do a lot of this church, really. They did quite respected. Okay, enough of the churches. I'll give you a little bit more of a sense of the early parish. This is more than the early parish, but we're very, very lucky to have it because it's the only remaining sheet, probably the only sheet that's ever drawn, of a favour by the great Wenceslas Holland, the supreme engraver and artist of the middle years of the 17th century, Czech emigre to England. And it's supposed, most theorists of these matters believe that he intended to have a map that would see the whole of London. But this was the only sheet we have, and may very well be the only sheet that ever was. And what you can see it shows is the whole of the area from Holborn Park running along the top there, right down to the Thames, and here you can see the Strand Palaces, because this is all well south of St Giles, but it does show the whole of St Giles as it was then, including Lincoln's Inn Fields, still not completed. You can see the north side and the south side is still what? Going too fast here. There it is. Beautiful bird's eye view. Don't trust every single detail. It's a bit dodgy in some respects. It's wonderfully, beautifully drawn. And lots of things still to come. This is the site of St Giles here, St Giles's Fields. So the whole thing is a fantastic acquisition to have, and it's pretty accurate. And you see Drury Lane is a very important street running down the middle. All those modern streets having Oxford Street aren't yet there. A little bit now about what it looked like at the time. It was, for quite a short time, St Giles in the 17th century, a very posh area indeed. There were lots of valleys around the church and so forth, but there were also lots of very grand houses, very grand people living there. Didn't last so long. After about 1700, it dwindled even before that, really, because here's a token of some of the best part. Lincoln's Inn Fields, of course, that's an early view showing how the open ground was at the time. We've actually got a whole chapter to do about the open space of Lincoln's Inn Fields, because we felt things like John's Saint to the north side more than that covered. So we concentrated our chapter there on the open space. And here you see these rather interesting pilastered houses which ran all the way along the west side of Pitfield. Just one is left, I'm not showing that. But they were very similar also to other houses which were close by in Great Queen Street, if some of you know where that is, just to the west of Kingsway. In the existence of Kingsway, which I'll show you in just a second, a bit later, is cuts off Lincoln's Inn Fields to Great Queen Street, but they're actually all part of one development division and had a very interesting history. They began very much with aristocratic houses, some of them very grand indeed. This is one of the last survivors. They've all gone now from the 1630s. Probably designed by a chap called Peter Mills, although there's a lot of arguments still going now into architecture. I mustn't spend too long on that, but they had to be by very grand people. A lot of them recusants of Catholics, and a lot of them changed hands during the parliamentarian period and never really recovered to the same degree after that. So that was one of the reasons that area, I think, went down. It was never quite the same after the Civil War, probably apogee of about 1640. And here just shows immediately something that controversy, of course, this is immensely difficult and contested time. Now, this shows the west side of Lincoln's Inn Fields again from the middle, and it is, the more you look at it, the more it's actually quite accurate. It shows the west side again with the tallest house in the middle, which is indeed the one still there, and in the front, what's all that? Well, the answer is papist books and ornaments being burnt. And the reason they're doing that is because under James II, there was, he was Catholic, of course, encouraged a monastery to be built there in the area where the then Portuguese embassy was, later the Sardinian embassy chapel. And when William III came in, bringing glorious revolution and Protestant succession and all that stuff, the monastery was sacked and the books were burned in the centre of the square of the fields, which is a very interesting dramatic representation, and seemed to be tolerably accurate in some respects. So just a bit before we mustn't spend too much on the remote past, just a few pictures of interesting people who lived in the parish in that time, who I invented the term Gilesians, which perhaps other people have before that, but we'll have to do for tonight. At any rate, perhaps you shouldn't survive that long. There were poets, there were literary people, Milton, who were a bit in Holborn. The other great poet of the sort of third quarter of the 17th century, Andrew Marvell, was in Great Russell Street for a bit, died under mysterious circumstances and is buried in the burial ground, probably, or in the church. And the other poet up there is George Chapman. And George Chapman was a little bit earlier, he's an Elizabethan figure. He translated Homer, and he was a great friend of Inigo Jones, the architect of the king, who obviously loved him sufficiently, although Chapman had fallen hard times when he died, but he made a little monument to him, which was originally in the churchyard, but it's still there inside the church. It was brought in sometime in the 19th century in a slightly decayed state. It's still there to see inside the church. To look for the North Arm. Here another couple of people, just different people. This is a rather interesting chap called Lestrange, who got into difficulty because people say he was Catholic, he wasn't. There was a lot of paranoia about these things at that time. And then on the right, the Great Queen Street area became very important to the Centre for Artists in the late 17th, early 18th century. And this is the chap who's most important. So Godfrey Kneller, rather pompous chap. This is an early self-portrait before he went to the Great Queen Street, who founded a very important academy for painters in the street at the time. So there are some figures from the 17th century history. Moving on to the 18th century, and the wigs were changed by this time, of course. So here's some more of these people. Just to give you 2 sets, don't worry, there's more to come. I wanted to put these people in, although they're not absolutely certainly identified because they are, of course, Farrers, as some of you will know, among the smartest and most elite lawyers in the land, are still where they have been since the 18th century on the northwest corner of the fields, the Queen's lawyers, and have patched up a lot of things in their time. And these are the 2 Farrers, alleged to be the 2 Farrers of Grand Tour. Different kind of chap. This man, Hugo, at least by origin, who was a clockmaker, has to stand for the great crafts tradition, which people associate a little bit more with Soho than St Giles, but industry and crafts are very, very important. In a rather wonderful portrait of about 1770 by his friend Zoffany, who also lived in the parish. So that's me for a bit. Now, see it isn't good.
Hope it's not too much misery, and also apologies for me croaking. Just check. Good. St Giles, and I'm going to read, has a long history of being a home for people who, for various reasons, are considered to be on the outskirts of society. So what I thought I'd focus on this evening for my section are those sections of the book which tell us about how the parish sought to care for, contain, and reform some of those groups of people, beginning with the hospital at St Giles in the Fields. And if there's time, I'll end on some of the parish's pioneering housing schemes. That St Giles became associated with the outcast was no doubt due to its outpost position to the west of the city, where the Hospital of St Giles was founded by Queen Matilda, or Maud, Queen Consort of Henry I of England, in about 1117-18. And this was, as you will know, founded as a hospital for lepers. St Giles was the patron saint of cripples and therefore lepers, amongst other people. And he's usually represented as a simple abbot with a staff, as here on the left. A common seal depicting him with a crozier and an alms box was in use by St Giles Hospital by 84 or 5. This unique institution grew into England's most important leper hospital, with permanent buildings, a chapel, a surrounding precinct, and endowments to dignify its status. It was one of London's 10 or so leper hospitals that were located in a ring around its approach roads in prominent positions where people could leave alms. And modern scholarship shows that leprosaria, as they were called, were not isolation hospitals, but civic institutions of which their cities were proud. Carol Rawcliffe, an academic medical historian, describes them as establishing a spiritual cordon of prayer around the city, which I think is rather lovely, whereby hospitalized lepers whose prayers were thought to be particularly effective and the wider community were bound in mutual obligation. We have very few contemporary illustrations of the hospital, and most 19th century depictions are impressionistic at best. On the right here is what's thought to be one of the earliest sketch of the hospital, and this is in the margin of Matthew Paris's 13th century chronicle. The hospital was seldom free from controversy and interference. Though it was founded by Matilda, it was soon placed under the jurisdiction of the City of London, where the inmates came from. But gradually the Crown began to take a greater interest, and then to install cronies on the lands there. And so too did the master. In 1299, the hospital was formally granted to the Order of St Lazarus of Jerusalem, and there were also quarrels with the Bishop of London over visitation rights. I don't expect you to read them, and if you can, your medieval French is better than mine. These disputes have left a paper trail that tell us more about how the hospital was run, and occasionally we hear from the lepers too. This list of deeds on the left of 1402 for St Giles shows that where previously Londoners had lavished gifts of land and rent upon the hospital, after its takeover and mismanagement by the Order of Jerusalem, they stopped giving and set up other institutions. Richard II's caused further upheavals by annexing the hospital to the Abbey of St Mary Grace's Tower Hill. Not long after, the resident lepers petitioned him, the king and Parliament, this is the document on the right, to complain of their want of maintenance. They weren't being looked after properly. By the 15th century, the lepers had been largely ousted in favour of better off citizens who wanted to live in this convenient place. And at the dissolution of the monasteries, the various properties within the precinct of St Giles, immediately round the hospital and chapel, which I'll come to, it actually owned lands that went far further afield than the immediate area. The various properties within the precinct of St Giles were divided between noble claimants, while the chapel was turned into the first parish church. From around this time, we have the first surviving views of the hospital precinct and the parish church. And here we see, I don't know if the light works, St Giles in the centre, rising above the marshy grounds. So this must be the original hospital chapel, or presumably an adaptation or a conversion of it. We don't really know. And this is a bird's eye view of 1585 from a legal dispute, showing the precinct with the church at the top. Again, just then. And the larger map that it comes from. We can see the heart-shaped precinct and the church much more clearly in Hollar's famous bird's eye view, which Andrew was just talking about, dated about 1658. Now, if you keep your eye on the section just to the north of the church, the tangle of streets and fields on the opposite side of St Giles High Street, we're going to shift our focus north and move on to the section of the book which looks at poverty. From the time of its first intensive development in the 17th century, there had been concerns about poor and densely populated parts of St Giles. As early as 1637, vestry minutes record that the beadle was ordered to present the names of all newcomers, underletters, inmates, divided tenements, persons that have family in cellars, and other abuses. Public attention on the problems of St Giles, focused mainly on crime, prostitution and drunkenness, started around the mid-18th century, at the height of the gin craze. Among the first to voice concerns was Saunders Welch, High Constable of Holborn from 1745, and the leader of the Bow Street Runners, formed by his friend, the author and magistrate Henry Fielding. And there were soon numerous other complaints and characterizations of this outlaw behaviour. As yet, they were not particularly or especially focused upon the Rookery area, this area just up there, as it became to be called, a byword for depravity and squalor. So there it is. But from the 1760s onwards, the so-called mean old buildings north of the church, sometimes referred to as the ruins of St Giles, come into clearer focus. This innocent-looking area, surveyed here in 1783, was at the heart of the St Giles Rookery. Most of its houses were no more than a century old at this time, but they had slid in social status, and most were in multi-occupation. Pubs, which you might be able to make out here, included the Maidenhead, the Noah's Ark and the Rose and Crown, and in the centre, a huge Kirkman's Brewery. Here, newspapers reported, street robbers escaped, men and women fought, and anti-Catholic preachers were attacked. Here's a view of what unwary Londoners or visitors might expect if they strayed too close to the rookery from St Giles High Street, with the parish church in the background. Inside the rookery, things were worse. Sheltered within its pubs and lodging houses, hundreds of beggars clustered, according to a series of early 19th century government and other official reports, and somewhat more salacious accounts. The rookeries, lodging houses, pubs, and their residents featured in Pierce Egan's smash hit book series Life in London of 1821, a graphic ramble through metropolitan high and low life. The protagonists, Tom and Jerry, are here carousing with frequenters of the Noah's Ark in Dyot Street, where the customers included Billy Waters, the one-legged musical Negro, so-called, and his successor as king of the beggars, Little Jemmy or Andrew Whiston. These views by John Wickham Archer, made shortly before New Oxford Street ploughed through the centre of the rookery, offered a more sympathetic and even sentimental view of urban poverty in the parish. And I think he's become one of our favourite painters, hasn't he, Andrew? They're hard to square with the increasingly desperate accounts, though, of the moral and sanitary depths to which the tangle of streets known as Little Dublin and the Holy Land, or their cluster of Irish residents opposite the church had run. This is 21 Church Lane in the remaining rookery area at mid-century. Images like these, based on real-life surveys of the 1840s and mindful of recent cholera outbreaks, were part of the campaign to reform dwellings, drainage and overcrowding. Some, but not all of this reforming activity was also designed to reform the tenants, who were often blamed for the conditions in which they lived. But occasionally we can hear from them, such as in the letter on the right from Church Lane residents to the editor of the Times, London Times, pleading for mains drainage, clean water, and crucially the regulation of landlords who profited from cramming decrepit dwellings from cellar to garret with tenants. They were literally stuffed full. Long before the Rookery and Drury Lane slums crashed onto public notice, there were primitive arrangements in St Giles, as in every parish, for dealing with the indigent poor, and these focused on the workhouse, the largest and oldest parish institution after the church. St Giles got its first regular workhouse in 1725, and it was initially formed from a cluster of new and adapted buildings on a site running east from the present Endell Street. But it was enlarged and reconfigured several times over. And you can see this is the site in the early 19th century with the burial ground in green on the left there. Parish reports of 1724 set out how the terror of a workhouse was intended to bring down the annual poor rate bill by driving the idle gin drinking poor out of the parish and employing those parishioners who sought outdoor relief, bread and fuel. And St Giles's poor saw it as their right to have outdoor relief rather than going to the house, and that continued. Employing them as one family inside the workhouse and setting them to work. And these rules were published in St Giles, but also in Dublin, we don't know, but perhaps to deter would-be immigrants. The governor was to distinguish between those paupers in reduced circumstances and the idle poor. Spinning, knitting and shirt making were among the chores. Anyone causing a disturbance or caught bringing in gin was to be sent to the dark room for the first offence and expelled for the second. We know a little more about this punishment, the dark room, from a ballad and a printed broadside of about 1730 called The Workhouse Cruelty. These told of the death there of Mary Whistle, the good housekeeper of St Giles. And they accused the master and mistress of the workhouse of contributing to her death by confining her to the dark hold for long periods without food or water. So it's a kind of public protest. He was actually dismissed eventually, the governor. Scandals continued. The new Poor Law of 1834, so a century later, ensured that paupers were housed in workhouse and clothed and fed, and that children would receive some schooling. The harsh new regime was intended to deter all but the very neediest. Those who broke the rules or became refractory were punished in the house or in prison. In the 1830s, nearly 170 inmates from St Giles workhouse were committed to prison, the highest figure among those in London for which we have figures was submitted. And it was, says the workhouse historian David Green, a troubled workhouse by any account. This is some of the workhouse women in Christchurch, which was attached to the women's side of the workhouse from the 1840s. And there's a plan just there on the right. We'll come back to a closer view of the workhouse in a second. Inmates also protested in other ways. 17-year-old Bridget Summers, who I'm very fond of, was charged at Bow Street for insubordinate conduct and was one of the most refractory and wicked girls the governor ever saw. She declared that she liked prison better than St Giles workhouse and would burn it down if she could. She then rained down a shower of opprobrious epithets upon the governor from the bench. So the St Giles parishioners didn't keep quiet when they were unhappy. The workhouse was pulled down and replaced in 1879. The new scheme opened up a site at its centre with a square containing 4 airing yards, and a new infirmary was added in 1888. This equally severe block stood in Short's Gardens at the bottom, between the male and female dormitories. Despite all these facilities, the 1 acre site was considered too small for the workhouse's population, which in 1893 reached nearly 1,000 inmates. It's huge. Together with the expanded public baths to the right of to the left of the plan, which we haven't got time to go into today, the parish occupied most of this urban block, the whole block, by the early 20th century. It finally closed in 1914, though the remaining buildings survived on into the 1970s until they were pulled down to make way for Camden Council's Dudley Court, Dudley House residential development, which you may know. Now, if we've got time, just to whip through some fine areas.
You do that, and then
We're done. Then we'll come back to you. Because of its particularly intense public health and social problems, St Giles became a trial ground for housing from the 1840s onwards, so quite early. This is the George Street Model Lodging House, which was one of several model lodgings built by the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes under the patronage of Lord Ashley, later the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who invested a huge amount of energy into St Giles. And they were intended to replace the notorious common lodging houses locally. They were soundly built, well drained, clean water, and designed to prevent the spread of fire and disease. All is solid here, wrote one contented lodger in 1861. The George Street model has gone. Only 2 of the Society's many buildings locally survive, including this one. It's a robust model house for families, which stands just outside St Giles Parish in Bloomsbury and has been run by Peabody since the 1950s. The passing of the Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act 1875 and later amendments changed the scale of improved housing across inner London. Under these acts, 2 of St Giles' poorest and most decrepit areas near Drury Lane, centred on Great Wild Street on the left and Shelton Street on the right, were cleared by compulsory purchase and redeveloped by the Metropolitan Board of Works. And afterwards its successor body, the London County Council. Model companies were intended to build replacement housing on the sites, such as Peabody. This is the Wild Street development. As completed in 1881, Henry Derbyshire's Great Wild Street buildings was one of the largest slum clearance projects built by Peabody. Huge cliff-like elevations for the time. As no result was secured for the 5 plots in the Shelton Street scheme from model companies, the London County Council who had recently taken over the scheme from the Metropolitan Board, undertook in 1894 to erect the dwellings itself. So this is early council housing. London's first municipal lodging house was opened by the LCC as part of the same clearance scheme and opened in 1893. It was in use as a hostel until fairly recently, but is now private apartments, and that's where these very smart photographs come from, as you can imagine. These are still in use as housing, I believe. There were also a few later council housing developments, and this is Betterton House in Betterton Street, built in 2 stages in 1926 to 1930, to designs by the Holborn Borough Council engineer. There were a large number of applicants, especially from families who worked locally. But by now the population of St Giles had fallen dramatically, and housing and provision for the poor was no longer the pushing issue, which it had been for so much of the parish's long history. The 2 new public housing schemes in St Giles prepared for Camden Council in Endell Street and Newton Street belong to later phases of development, which I hope Andrew might come back to. Thank you.
Okay, right, it's now, we've been talking to you for 45 minutes on a hot evening, so I think I'm going to skip, if you don't mind, let anything from yet, so you don't have to sit here for half an hour. And so I will go pretty much onto the modern story. So forgive me if I don't talk about any of these pictures, tantalising that they may be. This picture of Kenneth Williams in Bedford Square, I came across quite recently. He made a film about Bloomsbury in the 1970s, which is very entertaining to look at on YouTube. Very funny indeed. So I prepared a little bit about Bedford Estate, Bedford Square. It's kind of the architectural jewel of the crown of St Giles, I suppose. But I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time talking about what's happened over the last since the Second World War, and introduce that by talking a bit about St Giles. You may remember that earlier on I showed you a picture of the hollow map with the St Giles development empty. Well, it's remarkable how St Giles is now smarter than it ever was. It was built in the 1690s by a man called Mr. Neal, and had this rather fancy architectural plan, which you see here. Actually, it could have been called 6 Giles, but one of the things that is in this very building is this rather weird plan bit, first plan for St Giles. And what you can possibly see is that not only are there only 6 rows, but they show there's one of the rows on the left is supposed to end up in a church, which also didn't happen. That's the area before development on the left. That's after, that's the plan, and this is what it looked like. A very, very sort of flattering view of how it was in 1770. It always had problems, this area, but it did have this wonderful pillar in the middle, which stood there from the 1690s and 1770s, and now, of course, was put back a few years ago by the local association, and it was wonderful work. So this area went down quite fast, it's never very much, and it's a rather useful introduction because it's from the south that the renewal, what I would call the partial renaissance in the book of St Giles, got to a very low state. It also lost a lot of population as people moved out to the suburbs and a lot of industrial employment. So it's in pretty low water by about 1920. But the Renaissance begins in the 1960s, I guess, and a lot of it has to do with what happens when Covent Garden Market moves across the 9 Elms. And that whole area to the north, which was full of vegetable and potato dealers and fruit dealers, or very dull area, starts to give place to other things. In fact, some of the most interesting things were happening at the Donmar warehouse a little bit before Covent Garden Market moved away. But lots of fascinating things then happened. That, of course, is Neal's Yard. And that is on an interesting picture showing a bit of Neal Street when there was still a bit of market, as it were, Nachlas remained over a barrow shop still there, next to a vegetarian restaurant called Food for Thought. So these are 1970s pictures when I think that the area was very exciting. Of course, what's happened now is it's become kind of boring the architecture, the streets are wonderful, but it's just monsoon and the usual stuff. And even Neil's Yard, which was very, very exciting, but so is really just a consumer's paradise. You know? So in a way, it's a bit of a story of a Renaissance followed by being overwhelmed by tourism, like so much of central London, which causes problems which you might want to talk about. But these just to remind you that people could enjoy themselves without consumers in St Giles. Here is after bombing, the industry open air swimming bath. It's a rather nice picture which comes from the publication of Hogan Years in the 1940s, with rather shabby things like the Shaftesbury Theatre in the background, which you just see. And so it's quite an interesting development since the 1950s of a gradual kind. What the street in the north, in the central, people now talk about so much in Malcolmville, when he introduced it, was Denmark Street. Well, Denmark Street has been a bit mythologized, I think. It has a fascinating back history, which we don't talk about. It was probably the first place in London where you could buy a water closet. How about that? Joseph Rayner had his premises in Denmark Street in the 1770s. He said you could only buy your water closets from my shop. He was basically the inventor of the modern proper flushing mechanism. So, but nevertheless, the music industry, which was really more associated with Charing Cross Road. Charing Cross Road was the first London equivalent to New York's Tin Pan Alley, and was so called often in the 30s. But gradually, Denmark Street has taken that over and groups, recording studios. Here's just one of them, Top Gear. We probably know much more about it than I do. And now this is what we've got. It is the Outlet building, which is something you may have seen just next to St Paul. And a bit horrendous how personal it is. But nevertheless, it's the reality of the St Giles area line church today. And just to finish off, of course, it isn't all enjoyment. There are offices, St Pontus is a good example, and there is a central St Giles. Go into St Giles Church nowadays, there's a kind of glow in the North Aisle of this building, which is a bit oppressive, I have to say. So it has to live with a changing area, and it's still. And the last picture I'm going to show you when we stop is this is the precinct around the church as it is today. You could cast your mind back to the 17th century and even before the period when Rebecca was talking about the leper hospital and the precinct around it. This is the self-same area today. Fascinating in its way. There's still all sorts of interesting details. This, for instance, was a scene painting workshop took quite recently with a special attic for painting the scenes for the theatres. But most of its offices, of course, are a lot of dull time and Denmark Street running on the front here. But lots of, and it will change again, of course. So St Giles as church with a burial ground next to it, so many thousands of people still lying in that area, lying in that ground, that astonishingly small ground. So as a survivor, and I hope lots of other things we could talk about industry, about shopping, about the theatres, not really time, and we've sat here long enough. So thank you very much for your attention, and please do have a look, and if you possibly can, buy the book. It will be very nice. Thank you so much.
Certainly do buy the book. I'm familiar with so many of the illustrations of the area, both in books and the local history collection. But there's a lot in here I'd never seen before, and that was fascinating to do that. So perhaps, are there any questions that we can take?
Hello, Andrew, Rebecca, thank you very much. Not at all. Thinking about your book, it reminds me of one which I haven't taken for about 5 or 6 years, which I thought was wonderful, by Alec Forsham, was centred on Great Ormond Street. Do you think of yours as a sort of sister publication to that? Is it the same over, or is it something different Alec was trying to achieve? Obviously not the parish history, I understand that.
Yeah. For the people on Zoom, I just repeat very slightly the question. It was the comparison with Alex Forsham's book on Great Ormond Street, and whether this book was of a similar need.
It's interesting you ask that, because In fact, the publishers, Brown Dog Books, were also the publishers of that book, and to some degree we modelled it on. I mean, of course, is it called a house in Bloomsbury, a street in Bloomsbury? I forget what it's called. But for those of you that don't know it, it's just a wonderfully clever and accessible book, all about Alec Forshaw's house. And it's equally fascinating. It is a bit narrow and stuff. Of course, he gives a great deal of generosity. His house in this street. This is slightly structured, I think, but I'm not saying it's better. But yes, there is a kind of similarity, and I think Rebecca and I both wanted to write a kind of urban history which is accessible and engaging, but not plain true.
Yes, please.
I mentioned to Andrew before the talk that my interest in this area came to life when I discovered my grandmother had been born in the Angel, which is in down on the left-hand side of the pub. And I wondered, particularly my understanding is that there's been a hostelry in that site, probably already because I think it's mentioned in the dissolution. I just wondered if you can hear anything more about the longer history.
Off the top of my head, no, but that stretch of the street, there was a cluster of hospital buildings there from the time in hospital. You can see them. One of them is the Spital buildings where the lepers were housed, and sometimes it shows a cruciform building. The pub site is just to the north. I don't know what happened, because we had such a big sweep of history and a big parish to cover. We had to stop ourselves. But there was more to be said about the Angel. So didn't do it. So.
Did you know much more? And I think the national school where she would have gone is just around, still in Camden Street, isn't it?
Yes,
Yes, and just speaking to the pub for a second, I mean, it's very much the parish pub. And I remember when Rebecca and I first met Alan Carr, who started it all. He took us to the Angel, and I must say, I'm a pub going. I didn't go. And don't tell too many people because I'm terrified it'll get too popular. It's still a place you could be quiet in I think it's a fantastic and really worth knowing. Yes, you're right. It's a very long history. What was it you asked about as well?
National
Schools. Yes, yes. That was built in 1860, I think. Designed by the son of the architect of the House of Parliament, and was an attempt to kind of get away from the bits and left out that schools, the poor, ragged schools and stuff. Education.
Attempt to bring up.
Yeah, bring it up and put it down for the churches.
Yeah.
And there'd be the private families. National schools would put the thing on a new foot in a funny way. Like many other national schools, which always means church of England, didn't do terribly well because the board school system came shortly after that. Those big, great red brick ones, which we're all familiar with, and those were immediately cheaper. After a bit, they stopped charging at all, and more popular. And so national schools went down about 1885 fast.
Certainly sparked many memories for me. Seeing that picture of the Parker Street lodging houses. Well, I went round there with some of the staff from the Camden's housing department who were running at the time. I'd be very curious to see how they transformed it, because if ever you wanted a set for a prison, inside there were like cell blocks with galleries and what I can only say are cells round it. If ever you wanted a film set, that would have been perfect for it. And
no, absolutely.
they were quite grim at that time.
The first LCC lodging house was very much model on a prison. They switched up to that, but I think it's been gutted. I'm sure that the cubicles have gone.
The cubicle had bedspreads with London County Council and large letters on them. I was tempted to see if I could get I suppose that would be some.
Even the chamber pots were stamped LCC, which wasn't just LCC branding, it was stock sets and resale. So the soap, everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting building.
Well, I must admit, on hot days like today, I used to go down to Endon Street, because at the back, there was the slipper bath, and I would use the slipper bath before going out to the theatre in London. So they've gone, but they haven't changed much when I was using them from the 19th century.
Yes, the first 1850s with pioneering public baths, mainly for cleanliness, on that site in Endell Street. And then in the 20th century, they were used for swimming. There's some champion Olympic swimmers practicing. The local Met division trained there. And then there was a new bath in about 1902, and then the present Oasis site. So there's had a pool on there for a long time.
Yeah, the slipper bath was just down the side of it, so they survived for a lot longer.
Huge chimneys to heat the water.
I went there once, but unfortunately it turned out to be the men only day.
Are there any more? Oh, cool. No, well, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I had a question about St Giles. You showed the hollow map where it's the raised ground and then sort of this, I suppose we call it now a drop-in development almost, right on the hill, and the seven way the streets and other design and everything. Do you think St Giles has its own character, or is it just better viewed as a part of the wider St Giles?
Oh, I think the street map gives it an enormously strong configuration. I was a little bit interested to know what it was based on, I think. I'm very pedantic. I think it's probably based on a development in Paris called the Place des Victoires, which some may know through Paris. It may or may not, I don't, but yeah, I mean, that is the big thing, isn't it? The extraordinary pattern, the brilliantly restored pillar or pyramid, as the classic called, in the sense of, I mean, change, yes, huge, but it's now, I mean, it was really in a terrible state. I mean, when we destroyed the Rookery, which Rebecca was talking about, of course, it's the classic story of the Victorian slums. Is a lot of the poor moved out, they moved into other areas. And St Giles was one of the ones most affected. Wasn't very good already, but the dramatic change is so quite extraordinary.
No, well, thank you very much indeed. I think we've had a really fascinating thing. And delve into the book, it certainly sparked my memories and imagination. Explore the area.
Thank you.
Thank you for